Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 25th of September 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is once again Torchlight 2. I'm very much enjoying the silly builds that you can go for in this game, thanks to the way that stats are leveled up, and thanks to the way the skill trees work. You can build some stuff that doesn't appear to actually be envisioned within the class itself, but still works quite nicely. This dual-wield engineer, for instance, I've got no dexterity on this guy at all, which you might think, oh, well, that would be bad, but if you get fumble reduction enchantments, you can get this raw DPS monster that is based around using the Flamehammer skill, a heal button force field to stay alive, and continual procs, which of course with fast attack weapons, proc more often. It's pretty cool. I like the freedom. Admittedly, you do get locked into your build somewhat, but that's also quite nice because you're forced to commit to a particular path and try and figure out what the hell you're going to do with your character. It may not end up being optimal or min-maxed, but at the end of the day, it's also a $20 game, and I don't really care. First email comes in here from Jason that says, "For many years I was an avid music gamer, playing games like Guitar Hero, Rock Band, DJ Hero, and the like. However, it was announced that Activision would no longer continue production of both the Guitar Hero franchise and the DJ Hero line. This was most likely due to the declining popularity of Guitar Hero in recent years. And this got me thinking, is this the demise of music gaming in general? It appears that there are no music games planned for release, and some of the more recent games, such as Rocksmith, haven't really become well known. I would be interested in knowing your opinion about the future of music games, and if you think that this is a genre that's finally ended." I just don't think it's got anywhere else to go. I mean, Rocksmith, for instance, is designed to teach you the guitar. It's not the same as Rock Band or Guitar Hero. Guitar Hero was never supposed to teach you how to play the guitar. Indeed, the only thing that Rock Band could ever teach you is the pro mode of keyboard, for instance, because that is actually you playing the keyboard. Even Pro Guitar, with the actual Pro Guitar peripheral, which has all the different frets on it, is still a bunch of buttons and isn't going to teach you how to play guitar, although it might help just a little. The problem is the genre got to the point where there was nowhere else it could possibly go. You have exhausted all of the instruments that would work on an electronic level. Rock Band 3 had keyboard, which was probably the last instrument that we hadn't covered. Aside from that, we've had guitars, we've had drums, we've had vocals. I mean, singing games are still popular, as are, of course, dancing games. But I just don't see anywhere else for this genre to actually evolve. Rock Band 3 is pretty much the perfect music game. And the thing is, it's also potentially indefinite. This game has a massive library of songs that are available for download. It's huge, and it can be continually expanded until the end of time, as long as they continue to sell. The problem is that they probably won't continue to sell. The game will lose interest, and the reason why games kept coming out in this genre was to keep people buying them, and to make them invest in new plastic peripherals, which of course was where all the margin was. Activision pretty much killed Guitar Hero by giving it to Neversoft as opposed to Harmonix and Red Octane. Neversoft might be able to make a mean Tony Hawk game, but they were not very good at Guitar Hero, and all of the Neversoft Guitar Hero games, in my opinion, were nowhere near as good as Guitar Hero 1 and 2, and they certainly weren't as good as Rock Band, especially once it got to 3. I mean, Rock Band 3, again, is pretty much perfect. There's very little you can say about that game that's actually a negative, but it is a very limited genre. Something you got to consider about a wide variety of different games. This is a bit of a tangent, but consider that some people accuse me of having a bias against AAA games, which is a very silly attitude, considering I very much like a lot of AAA games. But here's the thing. The reason why this is perceived is because I tend to be more critical of AAA games, and I go more in depth on the analysis, because there's more to analyze. There are so many indie puzzle platformers that are based around a single mechanic, and the whole game is based around that. It's like, alright, well, it platforms well, the mechanic's interesting aesthetic, good soundtrack, and done. What else is there really to say about it other than that? But then you look at a really complicated game, and you've got to go really in depth with it. And let's be honest, a $60 game with DLC is something that should be looked at more carefully than a $5 platformer made by two people. I would apply this attitude to music games. I just don't see where else you can actually go with them. The formula still works really, really well, but the problem is trying to sell people the same thing over and over again Once we got to PlayStation 3 and 360, there was no need to do that anymore. You didn't need to sell Guitar Hero Rock the 80s, for instance, or Guitar Hero Aerosmith, or all this other stuff. You didn't have to sell that because everything could be done via a DLC system, and then Rock Band created this massive library of tracks. There's just no reason to make those games anymore. And it was a fairly short-lived genre, and I'm not exactly surprised by that, honestly. It's just so limited. There's not a lot you can do with it, and everything that could be done with it has, in my opinion, been done. Maybe when we get to the next generation, someone will come up with something a little bit different, or maybe we get the Kinect incorporated into it, and maybe you then have both a band and a dancing game, and then you go careening into each other and fall over the plastic peripherals, and then the television gets broken, and then there's a household argument. Yeah, that sounds like fun. Rock Band 4, Domestic Violence. Now we're running into one of those ruts again, where we get the same old questions. Again, I think it's probably issue with the format and the fact that this show has now run for so long that we've answered hundreds upon hundreds of topics, and it's getting difficult for people to come up with original stuff. So I don't really blame people, but once again, we shall go to Twitter and find a few quick fires. So here's one from Nyon7 that says, do you think it's fair that every Torchlight 2 review compares it to Diablo 3, comparing a $20 game by small studio to Diablo 3, etc.? I think in this case, it is absolutely fair to compare the two, and it's funny that you should even consider it to be detrimental to Torchlight 2, because as far as I'm concerned, if you do a direct comparison between those two games, then Torchlight 2 comes out ahead in many aspects. Not all of them, certainly not all of them, but many very important aspects. This is going to happen. The reason it's going to happen is because a lot of the team behind Torchlight 2 were the head honchos over at Blizzard North when Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction were made. Think about this another way. John Carmack leaves id, goes to form another company, and creates a game that is essentially the spiritual successor to Doom, but isn't called Doom. He leaves with a good number of the founding members that created the Doom and Quake series, and then id Software goes on to create Doom 4. Let's ignore the fact that Doom 4 is actually happening. Let's assume that it wasn't. So, out comes Doom 4. It doesn't end up being everything that people want. It has a number of problems. And then the spiritual successor from John Carmack's new company comes around, and it gets reviewed. Now, do you seriously think that it will not be compared to John Carmack's previous work? It will be. Do you think it won't be compared to Doom 4? It will be. If Diablo 3 was a genuinely magnificent game, and if it was universally acclaimed and universally well received, then I think this would be less of a problem. The thing is, it wasn't. Diablo 3 has a ton of problems. It received a significant amount of backlash from its fan base. It made a number of very questionable decisions from a business standpoint that can be construed as anti-consumer, including Always on DRM and the Real Money Auction House. Diablo 3 received a number of changes which some people did not like, such as the removal of stat distribution, such as the complete change of the way that skills work. There are no talent trees anymore. Health globes, no Heraldric Cube, the list goes on and on and on. And since people have been waiting for so long for this sequel to Diablo 2, obviously it's going to be put under a really hefty microscope, and everyone over that decade has had the chance to come up with a huge set of preconceptions about what they think the game should be. And this doesn't mean that they're wrong in coming up with these preconceptions. Far from it. They have the right to believe what they want to believe when it comes to what they expected from that game, and whether or not the game actually fulfilled those expectations. For some people it did, for some people it did not. Torchlight 2 is far, far closer to Diablo 2 than Diablo 3 is. Torchlight 2 is a Diablo 2 clone, which is entirely fair to say, considering those are the guys that pretty much made it to begin with. You could say, well, you can't clone your own game, but you really can. What you can't do is rip off your own game. Rip off is derogatory, clone is not. From 1993 to about 1997, the term Doom clone was used to describe first-person shooters. There was a rise in the use of first-person shooter in 1996, and only at the end of 1997 did the term first-person shooter replace Doom clone. This graph is based on Usenet posts made per month containing the phrases Doom clone and first-person shooter. It is natural to compare Torchlight 2 to Diablo 2 because of their striking similarities. By the same extension, comparing Diablo 2 and of course Torchlight 2 to Diablo 3 is logical. When it comes to giving assessments of games, it is more often than not useful to provide a frame of reference. Usually you do that by referring to another popular title. More often than not, that title will either be a very well-known title or will be considered a benchmark for the industry. Modern military shooters will be compared to Call of Duty. That will happen because it is the most prominent franchise in that particular genre right now. MOBAs will be compared to Dota. And indeed, the term Dota clone is still used, and we are in this weird transitionary period as FPS and Doom clone was, where we don't really have a name for Dota clones other than saying Dota clone. But Dota clone will not stick around. That word will go away, as it always does. We just don't really know what to call it yet. MOBA is coined by Riot, so one could say that that's kind of been forced into the vocabulary of gamers by one company, who are very much invested in the idea that the game be separate from Dota and not be called a Dota clone. So, do you accept that particular term? Perhaps not. And indeed, it's not particularly descriptive either. Action RTS doesn't work either. So, it's a particularly tricky thing, but eventually some kind of acronym will come up for this particular genre. It makes sense to compare Torchlight 2 to Diablo 2 and to Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is Torchlight 2's main competition at this point, and is a very big name. It is a huge name. Also bear in mind that a lot of people looking at Torchlight 2 are coming off of Diablo 3. Either they played it and they're done with it, or they played it and they were bored of it, they played it and they didn't like it, and they're looking for an alternative. So naturally they want to know, compared to this, how is that going to work? For the longest time, we've also had those comparisons within MMOs. I often compare to World of Warcraft because it is the benchmark that most people are familiar with. When it comes to reviews, critique, and comment, you have to be very careful not to assume a level of knowledge from your viewer base, because more often than not, they will not have that. But you can integrate the comparison in such a way as to explain how things work. So you don't just say, well, compared to the Diablo 3 equipment system, Torchlight 2 is this. It's like, well, what was the Diablo 3 equipment system? How did loot drops work in that game? How did the health system work in that game? You've got to explain that so that people know. So the comparison serves dual purpose at that point. I've read complaints from some people as regards to the comparison of the two games. They're sick of hearing about Diablo 3, they want to hear about Torchlight 2, but it's very hard to escape that. It is common practice to do these comparisons, and I know it's going away anytime soon. I do a lot of comparisons because it makes sense. It allows me to communicate my thoughts and to give people a really good idea of what something is like because they have a reference point to work from. The risk is overdoing it and making an entire commentary, critique, or in the case of other sites and channels, review into a comparison, because that's not really relevant all of the time. Comparison should be part of your assessment process. They should not be the sole thing that they are based around. They are useful devices for conveying information. They are not the only thing you should be doing within your commentary. Here's a nice one from Bendos1er. I assume that's what it is. He says, why do so many developers not allow filming when showing off their games at places like PAX and E3? Oh, God, I don't know. I would love to give you an affirmative and definitive answer on this, but I do not know. It boggles my mind as someone that does coverage because it's amazingly inconsistent. There are some companies that just let you do it. There are some that don't. And it's not just a case of, oh, the indies let you do it and the majors don't. That's not true. At Gamescom last year, we got so much footage of stuff that was AAA, as opposed to PAX where we didn't, and of course opposed to E3 where we definitely didn't. We've done 4 big events. We've done E3, Eurogamer, PAX, and Gamescom. And of the 4 events, I would say that Gamescom allowed us to get the most footage, followed by PAX, followed by Eurogamer, followed by E3. E3 is terrible for filming. It is a disaster area. No one will let you do it. Whereas PAX, you'll find there's a ton of devs, and they're either indies or they're kind of mid-level. I think that discerning between AAAs and indies is getting a lot more difficult lately. There are plenty of indies that I would call AAA indies that are producing very high-quality games for Xbox Live, PS3, and of course for PC. I mean, it's hard to consider a game like Hawken indie. I mean, that is a AAA game. That game looks absolutely gorgeous. What about PlanetSide? Now, they allow for coverage. It's crazy to see how many devs and how many publishers will flip-flop on the issue, and it's almost like it depends on their mood on the day. Now, I would think that the biggest reason is you don't want your game portrayed in a bad light. So you don't want it to be filmed over the shoulder or whatever. The thing is, that doesn't portray it in a bad light. People are smart enough to know that. They're not going to whine about the graphics when it's obvious that it's being filmed from an angle on a screen with a camcorder. People don't care. They will still watch that stuff. Whenever this kind of stuff gets leaked, it always gets tons of views, and people are totally fine with it. They don't complain about the look of the game. They're just happy to actually see an early view of it. I think what it really comes down to is control of the message. Publishers want to be able to control their marketing. They want a tight rein on everything. And you can understand why they're spending so much money both on the title and on the marketing of it. A live filming session at an event is a wild card, which is still kind of curious because it doesn't stop you from going to play the game. If I go and play a game at a show and I'm not allowed to film it, that doesn't stop me from talking about my experience in a video. It might not get as many views, but it'll probably still get a fair number. So what is the difference if I take a gigantic dump on the game in that video versus taking a gigantic dump on the game when I'm actually playing it? The funny thing is that you're less likely to do it, especially with a developer there doing a co-commentary with you. You notice that I don't really talk too much about the negatives of a game at a show when I have a dev there. One, because I have the dev there to answer questions, which is far more interesting. We can get a much more in-depth look at it. And secondly, the stuff isn't done. It's not finished. Everyone accepts that the game is not perfect, and there is room for massive improvement over the course of time prior to release. Now, of course, if the game still sucks on release, then you can tear it to pieces, but as I've said a million times before, beta is indeed beta, and show floors are not necessarily the best place to be giving in-depth critique and criticism, especially when you're hearing so much from everybody over the course of several days. You can pick up some useful tidbits, but it's really hard to focus on what one person actually has to say. I think, honestly, that the shows which are more open get more benefit. If you allow your game to be shown at a show, and you allow people to get their hands on it and to film it, even if it is over the shoulder or whatever, then you get a lot more exposure. ArenaNet allowed us to film Guild Wars 2 over the shoulder. That was totally fine, and the video looked reasonable. It didn't look great, but it was reasonable, and people accepted that it was a camera. And you know what? Those videos got tons of views and lots of positive feedback. BioWare allowed us to do that with Star Wars: The Old Republic, and that worked out totally fine. It does still kind of boggle my mind that there's so many restrictions on it. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. The industry's in a state of flux right now. Traditional print press, for instance, is becoming more irrelevant, and even large websites are becoming less and less relevant. And these days, people are getting more information from individual YouTube commentators or from live streams, and that's something that I have noticed that more developers are opening up to. The idea of live streaming a game, either at an event or independently, or just giving the game to a few personalities and saying, play our game, see what you think about it, say whatever the hell you want about it, it's fine. And that's a really nice place to be. I think that that's a perfect balance between marketing and honesty. It allows people to say whatever they want about the game, and yet they still get brand awareness, they still get exposure, and they might even get some useful feedback in the process. If that's where we're moving to, then I would expect that shows will open this up a heck of a lot more. There are very few games indeed that do not show well at a show when you film them. Occasionally it happens, and of course devs are worried about bad camera angles or bad screen or whatever, and it's totally acceptable, it's totally understandable point of view, but honestly, I've seen so many publishers and devs that are just outright terrified of the very notion and want to keep such a tight rein on their product. Look, if you're willing to put it out at a convention or an expo and allow the public to hammer on it, then it makes no sense to restrict the idea of filming, because isn't that just exactly the same as allowing the entire world to hammer on it, to play it, even though they weren't actually at the event themselves? They don't have to wait in a queue for 4 hours to play the game. I have to wonder if that's actually to soften people's opinion up to it. But hey, that's the state that we're in at the moment. There are a wide variety of reasons why it's not allowed. I obviously, as a coverage source, think it sucks, and I always want to work with companies that have the balls to allow me, or indeed anyone else, to play and film on the show floor and actually give a really good in-depth look of a product that is not completed. I think that shows a great deal of bravery and confidence in your product, and I would recommend to pretty much any company to let people do that. What is the worst that can happen? If you're confident in your game, what is the worst that can happen? Okay, folks, that is me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. You can email in your questions to mailbox@cynicalbrit.com with topics for future shows. A couple of recommendations, since once again we're kind of getting the same few questions. I would recommend focusing on current affairs. I would recommend trying to give open-ended questions that allow me to go in depth, and I would also recommend not loading your question with a bunch of your own opinion, because if you do that, then what tends to happen is that you answer your own question before you ask it to me, and of course it extends the length and makes the whole process just a little bit more irritating. Thanks a lot, folks. I'll see you next time.